Okay, so chapter 2, the Constitution. This is the whole ball game for this class. Everything we do is really based on this document, because this document lays out the plan of government. Now, just to clarify, because I get a lot of confusion about this, the Declaration of Independence is not the law of the land. The Declaration of Independence was just a document that said we are an independent country, okay? And in that document it says all men are created equal. It is an important document, no doubt. Next to the Constitution, probably the most important document. But this is actually the law. So this Constitution sets up the framework for our government. And in chapter 2, it talks about how the Constitution was created, why it was created. It talks about the Declaration of Independence and how that kind of became the foundation for self-government. Now we're gonna govern ourselves, which was a really radical concept at that time. If you've watched the musical Hamilton, the king at one point is govern themselves. What? Who's going to govern them? There was widespread thought that this experiment would ultimately fail, but thus far it has succeeded, but not without a lot of bumps on the road. Civil War being one of them, etc. The Articles of Confederation failed. There's an announcement here, so sorry about that. I'll just keep going through this, because otherwise I have to start the recording over, and that's a pain. Okay, so the Constitution, you need to understand, first of all, here's another important point that I want to stress. I've seen this, we the people, tattooed on people's arms, chest, neck, and in some ways, I'm kind of like, oh, cool. Wow, you really think the Constitution is really important. But in other ways, that's a little frightening. And by that I mean, it's taken on an almost quasi-religious type connotation. That people look at it as being like a religious thing. And in fact, I remember someone once saying that they thought that the Constitution was divinely inspired by God. And in American history, we tend to take George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and we almost elevate them to godlike people. There's a picture in the U.S. Capitol, a painting in the rotunda called the Apotheosis of Washington, where he goes up to be among the gods. So we need to set that record straight right now, because when people tell me that this was ordained by God, like really, because slavery's in here, and I don't think that God would have ordained slavery. 3/5 compromise, other persons, enslavement was part of this. That's the only way they could get it ratified. So it's not perfect, and the people who created it are not gods, and they're not perfect. They were human, which makes it even more remarkable because in the summer of 1787, leading up to September, they're really just through compromises, just throwing this thing together and be like, let's do this and this, and there's all sorts of proposals, and finally they're like, all right, fine, let's do it, and let's see how it goes. And here we are 230 years later, and it's still working, which is remarkable because it's the longest constitution that is that's been used, longer than any other in the world. But it's also amongst the shortest because it leaves so many things subject to interpretation. So it ends up working out. But what is in here then? No. Well, that's what you're going to be reading about in chapter 2, and those compromises that they created. And it's actually what we're going to be covering for the rest of this class. So the first thing it does is it sets up a federalist system with the federal government and a state government. We have a whole chapter on that. We'll get to that. Separation of powers. Article 1, legislative branch. Article 2, executive branch. Article 3, judicial branch. That's how it's set up in here. Article 1, legislative branch. And then they're like, well, who's going to be in there? And like, how old do you have to be to serve? And what type of legislature are they going to have? And they have a bicameral legislature, which again was something that was set up, especially by southern states, in order to protect slavery. Because they're concerned that the larger states will become overpopulated and then will go against their interest. And then you have the executive branch, and the legislative branch, its powers are more defined. The executive branch is much more into interpretation. And then, of course, the judicial branch, which are the courts, and the Supreme Court being the high court in the land. Of course, what if this doesn't work? And they're like, we need to find a way to change it. So they have an amendment process. So if you want to change this, you don't like it, you have to amend it, which is extremely difficult to do. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, they do right away, and that includes the First Amendment, which is free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, and redress of grievances, and the Establishment Clause, that the government shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or the prohibition thereof. That's all in the First Amendment. So that's a doozy. The other Bill of Rights too, but we're going to go over those later. So this chapter is just introducing you to it. But when we have the chapter on civil liberties and civil rights, we'll be looking at the Bill of Rights in more detail. And that's about the gist of this chapter. So for your assignment, I have, of course, related to the Constitution. And again, it's the whole ball game. It's everything we do in this class comes back to this document. So, all right, as always, best of luck on your reading quiz and on your assignment. And if you have questions about it, please email me.